Okay, folks, we're ready to get started again. I need to share with you that our hope is that we're going to have a bit of a discussion here, but there is a limitation that doesn't happen in normal conversations, which is people have to push buttons here to be heard, and any two buttons pushed at the same time have the consequence of neither being heard. So we'll have to do a little bit of collaboration, exactly, Chris. Joining our speakers today are three panelists that I'd like to take a moment to introduce. First, Chris Maisch, who is the Alaska State Forester. It's a position that he's held for the last 7 years. Chris earned his Bachelor of Science degree in forestry from the University of Michigan and made his way to Alaska after a couple years working for the University of Michigan. Landed in Alaska, in Fairbanks actually, where he worked at the Institute of Northern Forestry before joining the Tanana Chiefs Conference, and where he rose there to become the Forestry Program Director. During that time, he also served as the chair of the Alaska State Board of Forestry. I think I'm about right here. You joined, Chris, the State Department or Division of Forestry in around 2000, and as I mentioned before, I've been State Forester for the last 7 years. Let me sure I got the years pretty correct. We actually had a little chance to chat last night, but we mostly got into family and genealogical history, which I won't share with folks. And, although the person with the real black sheep in the family is the next person I'll introduce, which is farther over, Rick Harris. There'll be a reason for all this, folks, later on. Rick currently serves as the Executive Vice President for Sealaska Corporation here in Juneau. He holds a bachelor's degree in fisheries from the University of Washington, actually born in Pocatello, Idaho. He made his way to Alaska, actually to Ketchikan in 1978 to work in aquaculture. And shortly after that, he was recruited by Sealaska Corporation to be their environmental coordination manager. And since that time, he has held a succession of increasingly responsible management positions in Sealaska, including Senior Vice President for Natural Resources and Executive Vice President for the Sealaska Timber Corporation, before his current position as Executive Vice President for the corporation overall. Finally, let me introduce David Secord. Dave is Director of Strategic Programs at Tides Canada before moving to Vancouver, BC about 2 years ago. He oversaw conservation grant making in Alaska and parts of Western Canada for the Wilberforce Foundation. And before joining Wilberforce, he was a professor at the University of Washington from 1996 to 2007, where he played a founding or leadership role in 2 award-winning applied environmental programs. He's a marine biologist by training and has been a fellow of the International Canadian Studies Institute and the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program. So we have these 3 distinguished gentlemen joining Dr. Martin Nye and Dr. George Hoberg. Again, I'm going to start our format here with our panelists asking any clarifying questions of our 2 speakers, and then I think we're going to try and mix it up a little bit. Again, just a reminder for folks that we need to be pushing the red button. I'm going to click mine off, and Dave, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Thanks, Bruce. Well, there's a fine line between clarifying and provocative, so we'll see what this is. Martin, you compared the Tongass to a bunch of other national forests in the western U.S. And, we all know the Tongass is unique in the national forest system, not only because it's enormous, but also because it's coastal, and it supports a lot of fish, a lot of salmon production. And the same is true of the Great Bear. And between the Tongass and the Great Bear, there's 50 or 60 communities, and every single one of them is coastal. And culturally, they're very oriented toward the ocean. And so my question is, you guys took a very terrestrial forest policy approach to two forests that are really very oceanic and maritime in their nature, ecologically and culturally. So how relevant is everything you said to the integrated marine land stewardship realities of these places?
It takes about 2 minutes for the button here to activate. I'll give you a second.
Well, I think the Tongass is different in many respects, obviously. We took an interest in inviting folks from the Tongass Futures Roundtable just because we were seeing some very similar themes and patterns in terms of the politics and the collaboration and what they were trying to accomplish in terms of restoration. But obviously the Tongass is the most challenging of all the national forests, not in terms of only the planning processes, the statutory framework, the place, its international political significance and symbolism in that regard. The old growth issue challenges things, obviously. Of all of those cases that we looked at, they're fire dominated, obviously. I think one of the most innovative, where some of the most cutting edge, sort of interesting forest management is taking place in the United States. Many of these initiatives are housed in this collaborative forest landscape restoration program that carves out some experimental space on the national forest to try some new things. And I know the Staney Creek project was one of those proposals and didn't make the cut for various reasons. And I think it's partly because that program is so fire-centric and fire-focused. So it's going to be, and the old growth issue is going to challenge the Tongass in that regard as well. So I think it is very different. And that's one of the reasons I was so attracted to this place. And I continue to think if you can figure out the Tongass, you can figure out just about anything in terms of national forest management.
Dave, any follow-up?
Can I just add, you didn't really talk about the fish, Martin.
Yeah, I was waiting for you.
I don't know anything about the fish either. So you asked a couple of forest policy wonks to come and talk about this, and that's reflected in what we focus on. You have a pretty good understanding of both areas. I'm wondering whether you see, if you were to move things into the interaction between the sea and the forest, in terms of the policy protections or the processes, whether it would be significantly different than the dynamics that I identified with respect to the forests. And would you also be willing to fund a new research project that would have Martin and I begin to focus on this and come up and study this regularly?
I can tell you Dave did not bargain for this one.
I think my mic is broken. Well, no, I just wanted to put that one on the table because as I visited a lot of these communities over the years, what you hear about in the policy environment is trees. And what you hear about when you go to communities is the ocean. And that's just a real contrast with most forest lands anywhere else in the US or Canada. And, it gets real tricky because of jurisdictional issues, right? Because it's federal for oceans in Canada, but provincial for forests. It's different agencies for oceans here in the States. And it's the First Nations in Canada that are involved in stewardship that are really pushing the envelope on integration. I mean, Ken showed that slide yesterday of the HELTSIC Integrated Resource Management Department. Well, that's land and sea. And those guys are the ones that, from what I've observed, are pushing the province and the feds to sort of get it together on land-sea integration. We know ecologically these are super integrated systems. And so I'm just, you know, taking advantage of a couple governance experts here, even if you're tree guys, to say, you know, what can we do to lower those barriers given the ecological and cultural and economic realities of this particular coastal forest system.
Chris?
First I wanted to say thanks both to Martin and George. They were very good presentations, and I have a question for Martin, and this has to do with the different collaborative processes, and I'm interested in the decision-making processes that were used in those different bodies. Typically, the one that was used here for Tongass Futures Roundtable was a consensus-based process, and I'm curious if that was used in the other collaboratives, or if they used a different model of decision-making. And then the second part of the question would be, did that lead to more successful outcomes based on this style of decision-making that was used?
Well, each group had a different sort of governing structure and dynamic. There's not even agreement that some of these would constitute a true collaborative. I mean, some of these groups, you know, one of the most interesting contrasts, for example, is the Tongass Futures Roundtable, which I believe started with, 33 members, and has not achieved a lot in terms of implementation. I wouldn't call it a failure by any means in terms of the relationships that it seems like that have been built and nurtured. But in terms of actually implementing projects, there's not been a lot accomplished, is my understanding, with 33 members. And contrast that to, say, the Beaverhead Deer Lodge Partnership, that has been very controversial in Montana, that ultimately led to Senator Tester's place-based legislation, which was with 6 to 9 members altogether. And they were able to hammer out a proposal in very short order and kind of lop off the extreme ends and get something done and roll it into a very controversial piece of legislation. And the impact of that, though, is that you're going to pay later in terms of how do you deal with those groups that are not at the negotiating table, that are going to be able to use NEPA and FACA and other laws to challenge the projects that would implement that bill. So each one has dealt with those issues in a very different way. I think the most interesting of all of those collaboratives and initiatives that I had listed there was on the Colville National Forest and the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition, where they tried to sort of come up with an arrangement that they would be able to give a thumbs up or thumbs down to Forest Service proposed projects, giving the Forest Service an indication of where to go and where to stay out of. And when those groups, when the Northeast Washington Forestry Coalition would give a green light to a proposed project, they were basically saying and making a commitment that those members of the coalition would not appeal or litigate that project. And that seemed to have provided a great deal of certainty to the agency and to those partners. But each has its own sort of structure for how that's done.
One quick follow-up. You said a short time frame for the one that was more successful. I'm curious, what was that time frame still when you said short? Because the Tongass Futures, I think we had about a 6-year run, if I remember correctly. And of course, it's not over. It's still continuing. But what was short?
2 years, 18 months to 24 months. You know, it's kind of hard to say exactly when those negotiations began in earnest, but altogether about 2 years.
I think it just shows that these collaborative efforts take a lot of time, investment, and heart and soul, and more than that even. A lot of times there's blood on the floor, it feels like. And I think I speak from experience. And they're not easy things. And I think one of the key things that I learned when we got involved with Tongass Futures Roundtable, there was a real opportunity to get to know people that you didn't really know that well in the past, and eventually there was a level of trust that developed between those entities. And when that happened, it was more likely you could reach, perhaps, I don't know if I'd call them breakthroughs, but certainly make progress in the issues you're trying to address. But you also said one other thing that I found interesting. You said leave the outliers. I'm not sure if you quite called them outliers, but the bookends
Yeah.
And I was wondering about the legal framework, George, in Canada, in terms of if everyone's not at the table, they don't have the opportunity, I guess I understand from your presentation, to seek legal options. And how does that work? I mean, I wish I had that option here.
So if any Aboriginal group with a directly affected interest would have the right to go to court to demand to be consulted and accommodated, but an environmental group, a community group, a tourism group that was left off the table would have no recourse at all. And so then it becomes a question. It doesn't mean they're irrelevant. It becomes a political question about whether they can make themselves relevant to the appropriate political body that is ultimately responsible for it. And most of these efforts sincerely want to have a legitimate exercise, and in order to maintain legitimacy, you have to make sure you're sufficiently representative. So all the ones, since we basically started doing this kind of multi-stakeholder collaboration in British Columbia around 1990, I would say there have always been good faith efforts to be as inclusive as possible. The most challenging issue is what happens when some kind of condition set on the process is perceived to be to the disadvantage of one of the groups. So, for example, if you're going to continue logging in areas that environmentalists are arguing should be preserved, a lot of the cases fell apart because environmentalists refused to collaborate.
This is a question both to you, George, and to Martin. Given what you know about both systems, is there any one or two elements that you would see perhaps represent the best of that system that has a remote chance of being imported to the other, or commends itself to being imported to the other?
Go ahead, George.
You want me to answer that? No.
What I admire about the Canadian system is the lack of pervasive role of the courts. And so so much of American collaborative efforts are stymied by the fact that if it doesn't go perfectly for one group, they're going to end up appealing. And that really undermines the sincerity of a lot of the processes. But because I'm a comparativist, I know that when you take a key element out, it serves certain values that you lose when you take it out. So a couple of values that legalism promotes, first of all, is openness and formality. You have to actually say what you mean and defend it in writing. Too frequently in British Columbia, decisions are made politically without a rationale that the public can see and scrutinize. And then the other one is finality. I don't know whether it feels like you have finality here, but at least when a court makes a decision, especially if it's a higher court, you're done. And when you don't have that, like in British Columbia, we keep putting off the resolution of the conflict because no one's forcing us to come to some sort of resolution.
Well, it's interesting, George is an American who's, this famous Canadian forest policy expert. I'm a Canadian studying American national forest policy. And I'd take the American system any day in terms of accountability. And, I think that it's interesting because it's often pitted as collaboration versus the rule of law. And instead, I've always seen some co-evolution or synergies created by the two approaches. I mean, you think about the Endangered Species Act or NIFMA's viability language and how effective that can be at getting industry and others to the table. I mean, I think what you need is an olive branch in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other. And that's most effective. And I think we see that time and again. If you study some of, the most studied collaborative in the United States is this famous Quincy Library Group. And every serious scholar who's looked at that case has come away with the same conclusion, that it was the Endangered Species Act and the potential listing of the California spotted owl that that got industry to the table. And I think if you take away those core bedrock environmental laws or undermine those laws like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA and others, you're going to see some undermining of those collaborative efforts as well. So I think there's a healthy tension between the two approaches.
Rick, I couldn't help but look to you when George made the comment about finality in court.
Well, yeah, that's, there's no finality in court, and there's really no finality in legislation. I think we all know that. I like this discussion, and I'd like to come back, and Dr. Carvala, I probably said his name wrong, you know, he described climax species, and his theory of climax species is Exxon, Mobil, Toyota. And I think that what George just told us is that a climax species is also the environmental groups, and they were effective at bringing the industry to come to the table to work on a solution. Now, I'm not sure if that's a complete solution yet. So it seems that there is, in fact, you know, the idea is somebody finding leverage in one way or another to be able to make their vision known. And so I want to come back to Martin because he's the proponent of strong laws to do that. And I'd like for you to tell me if you think the forest planning rule that's just come out, will that create more controversy? Will it create more litigation? Will it really bring things to a screeching halt? And then I'd like to see if George has any views on that. I told you I was going to ask that.
I didn't know you were serious. I have a lot to say. I've been involved in the forest planning rule process for a while. I was able to serve on that national science panel. I guess I'm personally.
Rick, if you could catch yours off.
I'm ambivalent about the rule. There's a lot in that rule. Personally, a lot in the rule that I like. I would prefer to have more shalls in the rule than we'll consider. And when it first came out, I tallied up the number of we shall do this and we shall do that, and I think there could be more of those in there. It will certainly not simplify the planning process at all. I mean, given the number of things that the Forest Service is now going to have to consider and take into account using best available science and monitor, that it's certainly not going to expedite the forest planning process. But at the same time, I see it as a really faithful effort by the United States Forest Service to try to find an appropriate balance between the need to do adaptive planning and the need for political accountability. And I think it was a serious effort to do so. But like any new regulations, I think it's going to have to be field tested, and the courts are going to get involved if it gets through the courts. And that's still a question. But there's new language. There's a new mandate to take into account and use best available science. There's new language about viability and focal species and monitoring, and there's all of this new stuff. And that's the way the American system works. The court will end up deciding what these provisions mean. So it will lead to additional litigation by industry and environmental groups.
And I guess the question is whether you think of those process issues are necessarily bad or costly. There are costs to the process. But in the end, what you really want is to protect the values that you're pursuing. And one of those is species viability. And there are other values, community stability, the competitiveness of the timber industry that also need to be considered. I do not I haven't looked into the new version of the viability rule. I did study quite carefully the previous version and compared what the Pacific Northwest states did with the spotted owl under the viability rule versus what British Columbia did without having a viability rule. And the spotted owl's gone from southwestern British Columbia for many reasons, including urban development. But we basically put a forest plan in place that only required that it would be more than probable that viability be maintained. And it wasn't. And it was just shocking from the perspective of an American conservationist looking at what was going on in BC, what sort of policy you could get away with unless something from outside the system forced a rigorous standard on it.
Rick, follow up?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up, and I'd like to just put up a slide. It'll take me 1 second, so. All right, hopefully it's there. Help. It disappeared.
There's about a 6-foot drop off behind the stage, so if one of us disappears, call an ambulance, okay?
I just need that one bar chart. I just wanted to put up this one slide, which is a population trend for Southeast Alaska. And what you can see is that the projected population decline is going to be across Southeast is about 19%. And this is projected, this is past plus going forward to 2034. And in some communities, like Prince of Wales, it could go to 49%. Now we can argue it should be 49 or 30 or 22. The key is it's substantive. When we're talking about litigation and we're talking about forest planning rule and it's going to trigger litigation, or the recent NEPA decision by the court, each of those things is an important effect on the people that live in this community. And I'm wondering how in Canada and how in the other areas we actually address this matter in a way that keeps people working while we're trying to solve these problems, because we can close everything down until we solve the academic and the biological and the sustainability problems, but we're losing these kind of populations in these kind of communities. I'm just wondering how we work through these two obviously conflicting objectives, because there is a human effect on this as well.
Are you losing population because of reductions in timber harvest?
I think that you're losing populations for a variety of reasons. Reduction in timber harvest, fishing has been, the fishing permits are being distributed outside the rural areas, moving to more urban areas or out of state. So there's a variety of social and policy factors that are changing this population. But what we do see is it's heading down. Now, part of this population was large because there was a very vibrant timber industry. That's basically a mere shadow of itself. But there are a variety of factors that are affecting it. So how do we create and stabilize those populations so that those communities continue to exist?
Martin?
And
there's no way I can answer that question, obviously. But I do think one of the positive developments that have happened west-wide are that you have conservation groups thinking in a more holistic fashion about conservation and rural communities. Now, will this lead to a return of the sort of mega industrial view of timber management? No. But you have tools being used, like stewardship contracting, for example, making links between ecological and forest restoration and a sustainably scaled timber industry. And I think that's a positive development. It's certainly taking place in Montana. There are impediments to that, how you pay for it, how you provide that sort of stability and certainty, and all of those initiatives that I had listed are making these linkages between trying to figure out how to have a more secure land base, how to prioritize areas for restoration, how to have a more predictable stream of timber for local mills, what contracting methods to use, and then also how to have a more secure land base for protected lands as well. And that's caused some controversy because in a lot of ways I think it's a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift that's taking place, but I think it's a healthy one as well.
Dave?
Yeah, George and I were just talking. I think it's important to make the point here in the Great Bear Rainforest example in BC, a couple of things. One, ecosystem-based management is defined based on these two buckets of indicators, one of them ecological or biodiversity, and the other human well-being. And part of the whole set of Great Bear agreements was a $120 million conservation financing package, of which $60 million is earmarked for conservation and stewardship activities, mainly carried out by coastal First Nations, and the other half of the $120 million for economic development activities as alternatives to industrial scale forestry. And I know through some of Ha'ani's efforts, there's some similar discussions that are being seeded here in Southeast Alaska. These are really difficult challenges given remoteness of markets and other demographic factors in communities up on the coast, both in Alaska and BC, but at least that's become part of the discussion, and at least for a subset of the environmental community in both countries, that has become part of standard operating procedure to think about that, although I don't think that's infused the entire environmental community yet.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of keep the discussion going, and I'm curious, a lot of this hinges upon restoration and restoration type work. I think clearly that's where the National Forest Services enumerated that's one of their primary goals and objectives nationwide. So I'd like to challenge you two guys to each stand in two different sets of shoes, if you could for a minute. One, stand in the viewpoint, take the viewpoint of a timber person, someone in the timber industry. What does restoration mean to them? And then stand in the conservation point of view shoes, and what does restoration mean to them? Because I'm not always sure we're talking about the same things, and if we're going to succeed, I think we need to be talking about the same kind of things. So if you could just try that out.
I'm trying to think of what timber industry I want to be, first of all, and what conservationist. While I do that, let me say that there's baggage with, and one of the things that's quite obvious is that there's some baggage with restoration. And I think some of this comes from the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and this timber-centric view of restoration. And this hit home to me a couple of years ago when during this forest planning process, the Undersecretary of Agriculture made a statement that 110 million acres out of the 193 million acres of the United States forest system was in need of restoration. And for me, it made me ask that similar question. There's obviously some disagreements here about what that means, and some competing definitions. Now for industry, again, coming from the interior west, or in the northern Rockies where we still have a barely viable timber industry and some mills doing some really progressive things, they want certainty. They want to be able to have a more steady and predictable stream of timber, and they need a more certain supply of timber so they can make adequate investments. So a Pyramid Lumber or somebody like that in Sealy, Montana, who's been at the cutting edge of a lot of interesting forestry, is going to make a multi-million-dollar investment in a machine that's going to cut small diameter timber. That mill or that industry, like others, needs some additional predictability in terms of timber supply. I think from a conservationist standpoint, what would make conservationists a little more comfortable is a collaboratively defined definition of restoration So you can somehow filter out the phony restoration proposals from the genuine ones. And some sort of parameters for restoration, some sideboards, no new roads, and the like. And then also to be able to have access to conflict, different venues of conflict resolution. So if things do go awry, that there's some political accountability there.
I don't really have anything to argue from to add to that from the American perspective. From the Canadian and BC perspective, it's actually quite interesting because restoration thus far doesn't play the same role in policy. Not that it shouldn't, but it's just because of the structure of U.S. Forest Service land and its relation to other lands, and the dramatic declines in harvest levels as a result of these forest plans and environmental concerns. I think that restoration has come to play a dominant role in policy discussions on federal forests that it really hasn't in BC. Our big forest restoration problem is a problem of coping with the legacy of the mountain pine beetle, which on the other side of the coast divide here wiped out 60% of our merchantable pine species. And it's left an entire industry and the communities that they supported in an extremely difficult situation, also at a time of declining government revenue. So the government hasn't been doing enough to restock the forest, to promote as much midterm timber supply as we should have. And what's particularly disconcerting is just things that have been announced while I've been up here, that the government is planning to open up old growth reserves that have been set aside in those areas in order to provide enough timber supply for certain communities to keep their mills going. So that's a big shift and something that a number of people in BC in the forest community are quite concerned about.
Rick, any follow-up?
Yes, I can. I wanted to comment because I think that the idea of recognizing that we have a problem and putting aside our single ideological positions are part of what helps to begin to create a more collaborative process. We saw it in TFR. We got partway. We built better relationships, but we still weren't successful. But if we have the conservation community, the timber industry, the local governments all collaborating to say we need to get this done, and we need to stabilize the forest ecology, the fisheries, but at the same time be able to maintain some of the jobs we have, I think that's beneficial. And I'm wondering if, based upon our experiences, we're trying to find Tongass-wide solutions versus maybe breaking this down into smaller parts and actually empowering communities or groups of communities to take a more aggressive action. The Tongass Futures Roundtable was a Tongass-wide thing. And is there a way to potentially break this complex puzzle down into smaller pieces and then to have a durable solution? So I guess I'd like your views on that.
Let me jump in. I'm going to corner Dave on this because I know he's worked with a bit of that vision himself. Isn't that right, Dave?
Isn't that right, Dave? Well, I think if I was awake during what you said, Rick, I think, no, I was. I mean, I think you're pointing out key issues of scale, and I mean, if this whole banner, Coastal Temperate Rainforest, is pointing toward one forest, two countries, and Rick is saying in this case, Tongass was too big and we should focus sub-regionally, maybe on Prince of Wales or maybe in certain clusters of communities, I think that's right. And for certain kinds of questions, that's exactly the right approach. For other kinds of questions, it might be that the Tongass or Great Bear alone is too small of a scale. For example, there have been some recent discussions about carbon markets in the Great Bear and in the Tongass, and there might be access to bigger and better carbon markets if there was international collaboration at the scale of the entire forest. And so I think part of the problem here is that we tend to think about our forest as just the domestic part of an international forest in whatever country we happen to live and work in. And if we thought about it as an international forest, then we could think more clearly about what are the appropriate scales of action. And that might be local but international. For example, in the sister cities of Prince Rupert and Ketchikan, very small local area, just happens to have the border between. Same goes for Prince of Wales and Haida Gwaii.
George, any reaction? Martin?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I don't know if there's a right answer. One of the themes that emerged in that symposium in Missoula among those groups is that many of the successful initiatives had this history of starting very small, like you're suggesting, and building on those successes and moving outwards in concentric circles and building trust along the way. Where obviously the Tongass did not, the Futures Roundtable didn't really start that way. But on the other hand, what you're seeing, which complicates things, is that a lot of these groups, one of the dominant themes and recommendations is that they want landscape scale restoration. And this is, it's new land, I mean, it's ecosystem management, you know, this emergence of collaboration, adaptive management, landscape scale restoration are all descendants or progeny of ecosystem management, I would argue, so it's nothing really new. But what is new is that they're saying that the Forest Service, and I feel sorry for the agency in this regard, because they want the agency to be doing landscape scale restoration at much larger scales than they've done in the past. You know, the most controversial initiative out there is Arizona's Forest Restoration Initiative, which is 2.5 million acres. I mean, that's nothing for the Tongass, but for the American West, that's a lot of country. And that group is saying that the Forest Service needs to plan at 20 to 30 times larger landscape scale than they've done in the past. And their first planning unit, they're thinking, will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 750,000 acres. And one of the reasons that they want the agency to plan at such large scales is to provide industry with more certainty in terms of what's going to be harvested over the next 10 to 15 years. So you see those linkages. And I feel sorry for the Forest Service because over the years, like in a Pavlovian response to all of these appeals and litigation, the Forest Service has a history now of being very scared of thinking at large levels because every time they've done so in the past, they've got sued. So the Forest Service was starting to think about very small scale sort of restoration, and all of a sudden now you have industry and a large part of the conservation community frustrated with that small bore approach to restoration. So the poor agency can't win in that regard. So there's, yeah, and what Dave's saying, there's a lot of different themes here and all of these different mismatches of scale that I think are very significant.
Martin, in your presentation and referencing the 12 or 14 different initiatives you saw, and George, as you look at BC, where is the leadership coming? To what extent is it government that is a driver as opposed to other stakeholders? Are there commonalities there? And
you want me to start, Martin?
Yeah.
In BC, government was dragged into it extremely reluctantly. I mean, they wanted and needed to have a strategic land use framework, but it only got working because environmentalists were able to conduct that first power shift and force industry to bargain with them. And though that bargaining was conducted outside the table, unbeknownst to government, when it was revealed to government, they were quite ticked off to start with. And environmentalists and industry, that while other parties played a big role, that was always the core, is the relationship between environmentalists who had the market power and industry that had the economic power, trying to come to an agreement together and then bring the rest of the groups on board, including the government of British Columbia and eventually the government of Canada with a bit of funding.
Yes? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I guess in some of these discussions, I wonder if you can talk about, is it the force of personality that makes this happen? I mean, as we talk about these processes and you talk about what's happening, was it because there was a personality, a single or a couple of key drivers, a receptive industry representative, a receptive conservation? Because what I'm struggling with is how we find solution spaces and what causes them, and is it personalities that drive this and trust, or is there some other factor?
Well, I think there's a lot of ingredients, and it's a very, very important question, because first of all, there's the structure of the problem that you have to deal with. And some problems, if you think of the size of a decision space, some decision spaces are bigger than others and make it easier to come to a collaborative agreement. But assuming it's a very challenging problem, which most of them are, personalities make a huge difference, and facilitators make a huge difference. I mean, the quality, you need to have very effective professional facilitation that's able to take even the most challenging personalities and turn them into constructive participants. And people who have been involved in these processes, I haven't been a stakeholder in one of these, but I've observed and I've talked to a lot of people, and you were mentioning as well, the growth that people feel in the relationship towards each other and their willingness to compromise as a result of that interpersonal growth. That has to be nurtured over a period of time, and it's extraordinarily complex. And the more special people you have involved who are willing to take those risks, the easier it is.
Martin?
Yeah, I was surprised at how significant a theme that was. In these cases, the importance of a supervisor, a district ranger, in facilitating this sort of collaboration. But nevertheless, you know, one of those common themes that I started off with was this frustration with the sort of organization of the Forest Service. And that's not so much the personnel. And obviously, leadership plays an important role in that regard. But there's still a frustration with the organization itself in terms of what a lot of people perceive to be antiquated budgets and those sorts of things. You know, the non-integrated nature of the Forest Service budget system, for example. So a lot of those complaints that you had really good leaders and people in these key positions wanting to do the right thing, but keep running into the same impediments over and over.
I got a follow-up for you. You said something interesting, and it's basically it has to do with Forest Service culture. And you know, we've been talking a little bit about trust and developing trust and the amount of time it takes for some of that to occur. Just the natural tendency of the agency is always a district ranger, a long-term district ranger on a district might be 5 years. That's probably on the long side for some it's 3. And up and down throughout the Forest Service, there's a fairly rapid turnover of personnel. And you know, in the old days, I always heard that was so that that the Forest Service wouldn't relate too closely to the local people. Yeah. And it's almost where it's switched now, where we need to relate even better to the local people and be here long enough to help find solutions to problems. So I'm wondering if there's an agency, a rethink that has to take place about how that culture is today versus maybe what it should be tomorrow. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I understand, and that's my understanding of the history as well. Gifford Pinchot and his fear of district rangers and supervisors going native and being captured by local communities, and contrasting it to the problematic Bureau of Land Management that has this history of that in the interior West. You certainly want, like from a biological standpoint, I mean, I can think of so many stories and people that I know that have lived in a particular place and have seen 10 bear biologists in 15 years go through one particular spot. That can't be good. But at the same time, you want to make sure that you have somebody there in those local communities that is going to be able to represent the larger national interest and provide adequate safeguards in that regard. So I don't know how to answer the question, or if it will matter if I do.
I don't know that there was an answer. I think it was just more of it's an interesting discussion to have.
I'd like to maybe try to rephrase it a little bit And I think that George provided some insight, and Martin did. And I would characterize it as centralized versus decentralized decision-making. What we're seeing in the Tongass is more and more the decision-making is being moved to Washington, D.C. And what George described is a process that the Crown is involved, and it's more localized. And I wonder if both of you would comment on the benefits of a decentralized versus centralized as part of that decision-making.
I could start. It's one of the most important governance variables, and I see significant tensions and trade-offs in either direction. The way I think about it as a political scientist is the balance of preferences changes as the locus of decision-making changes. So if you have a community that reflects a plurality of appropriate interests, it can work in a very functional way as a decentralized entity. But if there's a big structure in the bias of interest there, then it helps to have some sort of external force providing some kind of check on that. And that's frequently why we don't delegate as much authority to community as we might otherwise, because we have values that are either at the state level, provincial level, or their national level values that we want to ensure are in force. And once you bring that in, it really does shift the dynamics that can happen at the local level. So it's a very challenging issue. It's one of the great dilemmas of governance.
Yeah, and I think in the American context, it's even messier than that, because most environmental laws, and federal land law included, is characterized by this cooperative federalism, right? That it's not as clean cut as we often think it is. We have the federal government setting standards and national level standards and regulations and laws, and often providing states and localities flexible means to achieve those ends. And there's some messiness there. And I think it's a healthy tension. You know, it's part of the American Constitution and the system of federalism, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Politically, it's also interesting because, you know, if you were to tell the history of the Tongass politically, and from an environmental standpoint, there was a concerted campaign to frame and nationalize the Tongass, obviously. And that explains the front page ads in the USA Today and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and it was very effective, and for good reason. These are federal.
Dave?
I'd just like to come back to an earlier part of the discussion about power and leverage on the one hand and sort of trust and collaboration on the other hand. And George talked about power shifts, including the market campaigns in BC. And to think really simplistically about it, it strikes me that the power for environmentalists at certain times on the Canadian side comes from markets, and on the US side comes from courts and litigation. And both Martin and George expressed opinions about the value of litigation and the clarity of things that you're litigating in law enforcement. And so I guess my question is, we've got a history of the use of markets on the Canadian side, a history of the use of litigation on the US side, and then downstream processes that once everybody is brought to the table, there's efforts to build trust and collaborate and form joint solutions. So which of those two kinds of power is most likely to lead to trust versus bitterness down the line?
Is your end goal trust? Is that what the objective is, or is the objective some appropriate balance of societal objectives?
That latter phrase never makes it into campaign literature.
But
I mean, I think environmentalists and everyone else who spends time in the courts just get exhausted after decades of fighting stuff and saying no. And if you really ask people, they'd say, yeah, we want some kind of a durable solution.
Okay, but if I were an environmentalist, which I am, I would definitely prefer the system of American forest law, because given the numbers that I showed about the protection of old growth, which is really the core value in a lot of ways in this area, That's what you get when you have an Endangered Species Act, a NEPA, and especially a NIFMA viability rule of the way that it is, and environmentalists can go to courts to protect it. It makes people miserable, and it costs a lot of money, and it pays a lot of lawyers excessively, but it actually gets more protection than you get in the collaborative environment in British Columbia that we're all celebrating as this great trust-building exercise. From a pure conservation viewpoint, it's not protecting as much.
So on the flip side, could you argue it also gets too much protection? I mean, the industry here has gone from over 5,000 people in the industry to less than 200 in the last 20 years. And you saw the resulting population chart that Rick put up. I mean, there's obviously some large social upheaval associated with those types of social decisions. So, you know, it's a real struggle, I think, to operate under the system we have right now for the Forest Service, for example.
So,
very difficult agency to be in and to try and get meaningful work done on the ground.
So what the structure of governance does is it shifts the allocation of benefits to certain interests in society. And I think that's exactly what you see happening in the structure. The combination of the role of the courts and the structure of the law in the U.S. shifts the balance of power towards environmental interests in ways that does not occur south of the border.
Martin, did you want to respond as well?
You know, one of the fascinating things about American environmental law in a comparative context is we think of how substantive some of those laws can be, like the Endangered Species Act comes to mind. You shall not jeopardize or take a listed species. But the vast majority of American environmental and federal land laws are not like that. They're procedural based. They're indeterminate laws. There's Congress basically telling an agency over and over again what it shall consider and how it should go about making a particular decision. And it's added on top of additional layers of laws and the steady accretion of laws. And I think that helps explain it's like Congress throwing pieces of a puzzle at an agency, telling it to go figure it out, how it all fits together. All of these puzzle pieces are in motion. So part of the amount of litigation is just that because of the nature of American natural resources law and some of this contested language. So the responsibility ultimately falls to Congress in writing some of these vague and indeterminate statutes, like the Rorschach test of multiple use, for example, or best available science mandate or anything else.
Don't forget VAT.
That's right. Seek to meet market demand, those sorts of examples. And let's just be clear, that's not just the American conservation community that's using the courts to get what it wants. I mean, it's something that, it's interesting, I read dozens of letters from timber industry regarding the new forest planning rule, and they are trying to make sure that they can protect all of those legal victories that they've secured over the last 10 to 15 years. And it's one of the reasons why they didn't want a best available science mandate. And they didn't want a mandate for the Forest Service to have to monitor to do particular things because of industry. You know, industry has fought those battles and won a lot of them and want to make sure that they can secure those wins. So everyone is using the courts to get what it wants. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where I think this rule of law is sometimes romanticized by environmentalists, however, because even when you think about the Endangered Species Act, we're talking about securing bare minimum viable populations of wildlife. It's a triage approach to wildlife. And so if we want to do something more in terms of restoration, in terms of securing animal migrations and abundant animals, then we need to go above and beyond what the law requires. And that's where I think collaboration comes into play and those synergies created by these different policy tools.
Let me invite anyone who would like to, in the remaining minutes, pose any questions to the panel. Approach the mic, please, and while folks are lining up here, I think we have a couple folks that are also on the panel here that are ready to say something. Oh, it looks like
I'd like to make one, at the beginning of this syllabus, it stops, there's a statement that says, what are we managing for and how? And I almost hypothecate is we really don't know what we're managing for, and until we can get to a consensus on that, we're going to continue to have the litigation, we're going to continue to have the disputes, we're going to continue to suffer these kind of problems. And I guess I'm wondering how we define what we're managing for. What are we really trying to do? If we break the puzzle apart into too many pieces, we lose sight of the big picture, and there are very large losers or winners. And I'm wondering, I'd like to see if people would comment on that.
anyone want to make a 30-second response?
The 30-second response, I actually think that we do have a lot of things that we're managing for. The problem is that you can't get all of them, and so we continue to have conflicts over that. That's the case if you characterize it as vaguely as ecosystem-based management, or if you take the combination of different rules that come out of American environmental law and other forms of law, they create a complex and bewildering set of values that you still need some process to resolve conflicts within.
Terry, you're first up, and so you're the model for everyone else. But I'm asking everyone to keep questions fairly succinct, and if you have a targeted person you'd like to ask, just identify him.
This has been a fascinating discussion, especially the difference between the United States and Canada and the way they deal with these things. If I were to give both of you a magic wand to do one or two things so that you could better manage for ecological integrity and for human well-being, including the cultural context, what are the one or two things that you would change in the system, both for the U.S. and for Canada?
Martin?
I'll give you a very cautious response. We need almost a policy portfolio approach, right? And seeing all of these different tools and what they work better in some contexts than others. But I come back to the same ones over and over again in terms of at least federal lands, which is my area of specialty. I think one, that we're in need of some experimentation to try. We need to figure out how to carve out some safe space to try some new things within a safe harbor provided by existing environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA. Somehow carve out some space where we can try some new things like restoration and these links to industry and community. It's so hard to do, though, obviously, because of the amount of mistrust and some of those laws that we were discussing. I'm also an advocate, and this is not always popular, but this is the longest period in American history where we've never convened a Public Lands Law Review Commission. And what we've had since all of those laws were passed in the 1970s during this, what people have called an orgy of consensus. We saw the Endangered Species Act numbers in 1973 passed in near consensus. It's been the longest period since we've ever tried to figure out how all of these dozens of laws fit and fail to fit together. So I would like to see another Public Lands Law Review Commission formed and providing a set of recommendations on what to do. How does the 1872 hard rock mining law jive with the National Forest Management Act, for example? So those would be two responses.
We're going to just move ahead with our next questioner.
I want to thank the panel for being so civil. I think if you held something like this in the lower 48, a hockey game would have broken out. My question relates to how much is enough? And we struggle with this as ecologists all the time, and just wanting to point out that the Tongass is not overprotected. And if you look at the statistics, you start out with 6.8 million hectares of land, you break that down, half of it is forest, a third of that half is productive forest, about 46% of the productive forest is protected, and only 3% of that is the real big volume class, the big old trees. So let's just be clear about the percentages don't tell the true story. That's why we look at representation. But I'm wondering too, how do we get the industry to decide how much is enough? What will it take to transition to second growth? What will it take to keep the jobs locally instead of exporting the products? What will it take to add value to second growth to make it profitable to industry? And can we get Tides US to pay for the whole thing?
Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Well, there's a lot in that, in trying to answer the question, and I think I'm going to start with the markets, because that's probably one of the key things. No matter whether we have, and for lack of a better way to describe it, an older school forestry model or a newer school forestry model, you still have to have markets for those products. And by and large, those markets are going to be offshore or domestic offshore markets, because we don't have a large enough population base here for a very significant market for wood products. Now, some of that depends, I think, also on what, how you focus the use of those wood products. If you're talking about domestic space heating, wood energy for communities here in Southeast, that's, there's a big market for that. If it's second growth lumber moving offshore, you're going to have to compete with mills that process, 100 million, 150 million feet through their mill. That's a lot of volume. And yes, yeah. So there's that we could spend the rest of the afternoon actually trying to talk about that question and some of the issues you raised. So it's got to be market-based either where it goes. There's got to be a way to use this stuff that's not subsidized. It can't come from payments and grants, and maybe some of that can help get things started. But we've got to figure out a way to make this pay for everyone in the end if we're going to get to where I think we all want to go.
Bill.
I think I'm going to direct this to Dave to start with. You mentioned carbon markets. It seemed to me, this is hearsay for me, but it seemed to me that there were carbon markets set up and some credits sold in association, at least, with the Great Bear or the formation of the Great Bear. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but how does that play into this, into opportunities to, and maybe how does that change the kinds of conversations that might be now or in the future happening between these different parties? And I'm interested both from the standpoint of federal lands like the Tongass and Sealaska Corporation kinds of lands.
Bill, I am so not an expert in carbon markets, but I mean, I can say that it's something a lot of people are talking about, and the devil's in the details. And, at least some of the regional First Nations organizations on the BC coast have begun to see that as one of a very short list of viable sources of own source revenue. But I think, it's a fairly advanced conversation, but there's work to be done. And, Rick, you and I were chatting about this in the Southeast context. But I think it's still, early days, but perhaps with potential, but fraught with some danger too.
Our final questioner for the afternoon session.
Yeah, I just want to say I really, really appreciate this discussion. I'm sort of a political science junkie on the side, and so this conversation has really been very interesting for me. So I guess I'd ask, in spite of all of the relationships that we've built through the Tongass Futures Roundtable and the progress that we made there, which I think several of you have been or are members of that group, I think many of the entities have retreated to other approaches to solving the problem at hand, whether it's legislation, litigation, administrative policies at different levels. And I was struck in the conversation about the different, in other places that you've mentioned that have brought people to the table, whether it's markets or Aboriginal law issues in BC, endangered species elsewhere in the Quincy Library Group. I mean, we don't have fire. There's not a threat of the forest behind us burning down that sort of leads you to a solution. I'm wondering if you see an immediate or something that's going to bring everyone back to the table, and do we actually need that? And can we continue? Because I would argue that we are doing pretty well at the project-specific level, at a community level, and maybe that's a strategy that's going to work, and maybe that's where we need to go, and we don't need the big solution, but I guess I'd put it to Martin in particular if you see something that would bring us back, and do we need it?
Martin, do you want to take Karen's question on it?
I know I really don't want to take it on.
Anyone else can answer. It's fine. All on the round table or have been on the round table, so.
Gun, something.
Rick, do you want to?
Well, actually, I think Bruce, because Bruce has actually been has been very active with the roundtable and the facilitator, and we watched its ebbs and flows, and mostly ebbs right now. But I think that might be an interesting one for you to comment on.
My sense is people came together because it was the last best alternative, I think, to litigation, and which had been the historic pattern for, we'll call it conflict resolution, but I mean, that's where people in the Tongass met to deal, and until people again recognize that across the board, and it requires all the stakeholders again to come to the conclusion that the doomsday alternative is again litigation, and that there is a high risk to all the players. It's going to be difficult to get those folks back together. Again, that isn't to say that there aren't meaningful efforts of collaboration that don't include every stakeholder, because that, as you know, Karen, is definitely going on. But personally, I'm skeptical that we're going to see anytime soon the kind of, I think, initial collaboration and goodwill that happened, particularly in the first couple of years of the roundtable. That's my assessment. With that, I want to thank everyone for sticking with us all this afternoon, but particularly my gratitude to the panel, and I ask you to join me in thanking them.